as Jesus died on the cross, he's not stepping out of character from who he is. Actually, he's most fully revealing the heart of God. We get wonderful things here about the sort of way our God expresses his power and achieves his kingdom. And it's not what we'd expect. It's in blood and nails and a Roman cross.
Hello, welcome to the Bible OverBrew with me, Rachel Redeemed, and Matt Sells. We are back for our second episode in the New Testament, jumping in to Matthew chapter 16. Officially, according to the notes at the Bible OverBrew, we're starting at verse 21. So we'll come back to why we're starting there, going right through to the end to chapter 28. We will be having a look at some of the key chapters of 26 to 28. But there is so much here, we might have to save some of it for some of the other Gospels to kind of come back and have a look. Maybe we might have a more detailed look at things like some of the parables on another occasion. Matt, tell me, are you ready to go with Bible and brew?
Got my brew, got my Bible.
I'm just going to ask in case you have something other than Builder's Tea, just to, rock the boat, maybe, possibly.
No.
It was worth a try.
Tea. I know it's decaf. It's my new favourite decaf.
Okay.
So just
Doesn't taste like it's been swilled out of a mackerel
decaf
trawler.
Tea that doesn't taste like the water you've used to wash a mackerel trawler, like most decaf teas do. So yeah, that's good news. How about yourself?
I'm on the rooibos, something to get us into Matthew's second half of his gospel. But before we get there, we have the joys of something of the story so far.
Yes, I'm hoping folks joining in now probably have snagged the last episode when we looked at the first part of Matthew's Gospel, where we did quite a sort of a long story so far, really seeing how Matthew is picking up themes from the Old Testament. And so in a sense, a bit of a sort of Matthew story so far, where we've got to in the Gospel maybe. So if you want the full story so far, maybe check the previous episode. But we're diving in at Matthew 16 verse 21. Normally we try and break it at a chapter point, but there's these kind of two key statements in Matthew 4 verse 17. From that time, Jesus began to preach, saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." And then we get another "from that time" statement in chapter 16. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things, be killed and be raised. And so after the introduction, we sort of got these two big chunks of Matthew's Gospel introduced by this phrase, "from that time." So we've looked at the last episode at this Jesus teaching lots about the kingdom of heaven, Sermon on the Mount as the ethics of the kingdom. What will it look like to be a citizen of the kingdom? Not how do you get in, but if you're a part of this kingdom, what should life look like? And this is beautiful picture of a from the heart expression of love for God and neighbour that isn't just about appearances. We see all the healings that demonstrate something of the restoration the kingdom's bringing. But we've just had a significant moment. Peter's just said at the end of chapter 16, said to Jesus, "You are the Christ." He's recognised, it's sort of at a high point, he's recognised Jesus the Christ, which means Messiah, same word, which means an anointed king. He is the king of this kingdom. He's the one who is bringing this kingdom. All the hopes of the Old Testament, Peter's saying, yep, you're the guy. But then what Peter hasn't worked out, what most people in Jesus' day haven't worked out, is this king is going to suffer and die. And so that's why Peter said, "You are the Christ," and Jesus kind of says, right, hold that thought. I need to suffer and die. And the rest of the gospel really will be an explanation of what sort of king he's going to be. Jesus coming to Jerusalem. And so we've got events in Jerusalem, particularly around the temple. We've got his death and resurrection in this second part of the gospel. So that's where we're picking up. We've had all this teaching of the kingdom, and sort of the focus is narrowing now as we get to really the road to the cross and resurrection, as one writer calls it.
Take us in. Who are we meeting? Who should we know if we're going to have our pink post-it notes for not just names of people but groups of people? Who should we be knowing our characters as they enter the scene?
Maybe you would resonate this. For many years, I think the different folks in Jesus' day, the different religious groups, the different Jewish groups, I sort of bundle them all together.
Yeah.
And couldn't really tell you much. Is that your experience?
Yeah, definitely.
And it's one of those things. We don't want to say you need to have a sort of a PhD in Jewish history to to understand the Gospels. You absolutely don't. But just to realise there was a kind of a various mix of folks in Jesus' day. And maybe, actually, if we just flick into chapter 22, we meet a few of them. That might be a place just to land. And I find it helpful to see who's around. I think at the very end of the Old Testament, in one of the episodes, we talked about the different groups in Jesus' day. Really, they're all answering the question, how does this story end? How does this Old Testament story end? How are all God's promises going to come about? And there's some different options for that. And so in 22 verse 15, we meet one of the groups, I'm sure a group that will be familiar to people in name at least. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle Jesus in his words. The Pharisees, we probably have known enough about them. They're kind of very picky about the law. They weren't actually a leadership group. They didn't have positions in the temple or authority, but they were sort of a community activist group, someone's described them as, who thought the answer to the fact that Israel in time of Jesus is under Roman occupation. There's no proper king in David's line. Clearly, the promises of the Old Testament haven't come about. How might that happen? The Pharisees think the answer is just keep the law more and more minutely. And actually, in contrast to the Sermon on the Mount, they did it at quite an external level. So they would even tithe, give a tenth of their herbs, their mint, their cumin, and their dill. So when they, you can imagine they went to the shop and bought some herbs, and then they would take a tenth out, and that was for the Lord. And just very fiddly on the details. And it's easy to be negative about that. And Jesus is negative about that because he says you neglect the weightier matters of the law, justice and other things. But to realize they're not doing it just to be difficult. They're thinking God's promises haven't come about. How might that happen? I think they thought law, more law. This will be the way. So they're not just baddies, though largely they're the primary group that Jesus comes into conflict with. If we understand something of where they're coming from, actually, then chapter 22, verse 23, the same day, the Sadducees came to him, and we get a bit about them here, who say there is no resurrection. So if the Pharisees were the very much kind of by the book to the letter people, the Sadducees, they were probably aristocrats. They were people in positions of influence. They're the old boys club. That's the way to think of the Sadducees. The old boys club. They've got the power. They want to keep the power. All the actual details about resurrection and theology, some of that can just pass by the wayside. They were quite well thought of by the occupying Roman forces. They're the old boys club who liked their power, didn't believe in the resurrection. And that's why they come to try and trick Jesus, to try and trap him, thinking, let's ask a question about the resurrection and make him look silly, because that's not something we believe in. Pharisees and Sadducees actually are very different groups. We maybe think of them together.
Yeah.
The Sadducees, that in a sense, they weren't so much trying to finish this Old Testament story as much as going, well, sort of it's okay as it is. We've got the power. In a sense, they weren't really looking for anything to change. The Romans quite liked them. They had positions of power. And so they don't want someone shaking things up. That's the last thing they want. They've got power. They've got the temple. They've kind of found a fairly comfortable sort of peace with the situation as it is. So Pharisees agitating more law, and God's promises will come to pass. Sadducees, do not rock the boat. We do not want any trouble. So you can imagine Jesus coming to Jerusalem with some of the things he's saying. Oh my goodness, shh, no. John's gospel is this: if you keep talking about the Romans will come away and take away our place in our nation, our temple in our nation. We'll lose everything if you just disrupt the things. So they're like, shh, Jesus, no, none of this. Two other groups. One that we don't actually really meet in the Gospels, but the Essenes. People might have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are the scrolls of this Essene community. They basically said, things have just gone so bad, we're just going to get out of here. We're going to go and form our own little sect out in the desert and just sit there and pray and hope that God sorts things out. So they were a kind of just almost like monk-like group who just said, yeah, we want God's promises to come to pass. We're going to go and just kind of sit and pray off to the side, not engage with any of this, hence why we don't meet them. And then the fourth group, and people don't need to remember all this, but I think just having something of this in this mix, the fourth group is the Zealots. They were the kind of sharpen your swords guys. There's some Romans occupying us, and we've got to get them out. They thought, how do we finish this story? Take up arms. Come come and fight. And so in a sense, they're not dissimilar from Pharisees in that they both want change. They just have different ways about how it's going to happen. We don't really meet them that much, but when you get Barabbas at the end of the gospel, Barabbas, who's in prison, ends up being freed instead of Jesus. Barabbas, who'd taken part in a rebellion, he was one of these kind of charismatic leaders probably, and that people thought maybe he'll get rid of the Romans. And of course, don't we find people treating Jesus like that? They wanted to make Jesus king by force. Some people see Jesus and they think, maybe he's our guy. Maybe he will be the guy to take up swords and bash the Romans. So again, so much detail there, but just to realize there's this melting pot. I mean, add to that, you've got Galilee, where Jesus is from in the north, which was, someone has said, it's about as different from Jerusalem in the south as rural Ireland is from London. And so,
wow, yeah, I'd believe it.
Yeah, knowing your family background. And so if someone from rural Ireland pitches up in London, and it just feels unfamiliar, and perhaps folks from London might hear the accent and go, okay, you're not one of us. When Jesus comes to the temple, or a Texan in New York, Jesus would have sounded different. He would have acted different. So all this is going on. But the question is, how's this story going to end? And power, of course, is a lot of it. The Sadducees, remember, they're the old boys club. They had the power, wanted to keep it. The Pharisees, they wanted to keep the law, keep the law, keep the law. And Jesus seemed to be just disrupting that by seeming to reinterpret the Old Testament law, making himself to be God. They couldn't handle that because purity is what's going to bring God's promises. And then other folks thinking rebellion's the way. Is Jesus going to be the one? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe when Jesus isn't going to be the one, they start to get disappointed in him. I find it really exciting to realize Jesus didn't just come into a vacuum. He came into this amazing story and kind of power struggle. And no wonder different people sort of opposed him in different ways. And amazingly, Jesus actually managed to unite some of these groups. They would normally be way going their different ways. They came together to attack Jesus because Jesus threatens all of them in different ways. And particularly in relation to the temple. And that's one of the things we'll see. If we want to jump back into chapter 21, just to talk a bit about the temple and some of what's going on there.
Well, in 21, we have Jesus's triumphal entry. But it's interesting, again, for those who are there in the Old Testament would have heard me getting very excited about Jesus coming in on a colt, on the foal of a donkey. So we get that bit here. Again, not quite on the white horse, maybe brandishing a sword that maybe some of them were hoping for. But we get Jesus coming in. People are waving their palm branches and putting their cloaks on the road. We get people saying, who is this? The crowd said, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. And then we have Jesus cleansing the temple. And then something strange with a fig tree. And then a bit more Jesus and authorities having a bit of a go at each other, and then more parables. What should we be spotting? I know from something you've directed me to before, there's a link between the temple and the fig tree. Could you expand on that for us?
Yeah, Jesus comes to Jerusalem, as he put it. It comes to the temple. Maybe we've got in the back of our minds that Malachi promised that the Lord would come to his temple in judgment. And so that's one of the Old Testament promises, that the Lord will come to his temple, but that won't actually be the wonderful thing that people hope for initially, that there'll be a judgment. Maybe we've got that in our minds. And Jesus, cleanses the temple. Often our subheadings put it, curses the temple could be another way of putting it. Overturns the tables of the money changers. He says, my house should be a house of prayer, a den of robbers. And then what happens with the fig tree is, I think, a beautiful picture of what's going on, because otherwise it feels very weird. But Matthew and actually other gospel writers put that next to it. Jesus comes to this fig tree, leaves all over it, looks leafy but no fruit. And then he curses the fig tree and it withers. And I think that is a sort of an acted parable of the temple. The temple is full of leaves. It looks so good. It's big, it's grand, it's at the heart of things. And Jesus is saying, but there's no fruit. It's all outward show, but it's actually a den of robbers. And I think him cursing the fig tree is a sign of, okay, the temple's days are numbered, because it looks the part, but actually the heart is not right. There's leaves, but no fruit. And then we see conflict with the religious leaders in some of the parables that follow. Many of those parables sort of telling the story of God's Old Testament Jewish people, how they've rejected God, coming into conflict with these folks Chapter 23, woes on the scribes and the Pharisees for being hypocrites. Remember, the Pharisees get all the externals right, law, 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 but he said, but actually you're hypocrites because the inside doesn't match the outside. And then chapter 24, a hard chapter to read, but Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple. And maybe just a brief moment on this, because it can be a confusing chapter and there are some different views on how it should all be interpreted. And so in 24 verse 1, Jesus leaves the temple, is walking away. When his disciples come to him to call his attention to the buildings, "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." This is the temple. This is the heart, if we've read the Old Testament, the heart and the high point of God's promises and relationship with his people.
Wow.
And Jesus is saying this is going to be thrown down. Actually, possibly even Jesus leaving the temple might be a leaving in judgment. As in Ezekiel 11, the glory of the Lord left the temple. Here, Jesus leaves the temple. And I wonder if that's, in a sort of symbolically, he's turning his back on the temple. That is no longer the place where God will meet with his people. In fact, all the stones are going to be thrown down. And the disciples then come to Jesus, unsurprisingly, and say, verse 3, basically, what? They say, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And this is where interpreters differ. How much of this passage that follows is about the destruction of the temple? How much is about the end of the world? We've got notes at thebibleoverbrew.com. I'm persuaded a lot of it is actually about the destruction of the temple, even though the language sounds end of the world like. And that's because in the Old Testament, language used to describe temple destruction, well, it was the end of the world, in a sense, for the Jewish people. The sky going dark, stars falling from heaven, all these kind of things. That's apocalyptic language. That's judgment language. So I'm persuaded that refers to the end of the temple. Therefore, all these signs of when it's going to happen was for the readers of those days, actually in AD 70, not many years after Jesus was speaking, the temple was destroyed. The Romans came in and wiped it out. I think then later in the passage, from verse 36, but about that day, Jesus starts to talk about the end of the world and say, and no one's going to know. So I think this is actually a profoundly helpful passage saying, yeah, there's going to be all sorts of chaos. Back then it was destruction of the temple. This isn't the sign of the end of the world. Actually, this isn't the sign to abandon all you know. Just keep going to the end, even through this, because about that day, the final return of Jesus, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, only the Father. So even though we can find it confusing, I find it profoundly comforting when we see end of the world type stuff on the news. We don't need to think, is this a sign of the end? Because Jesus says, you're not going to be able to predict it. You then get parables. No one knows what time the robber's going to break into the house. They don't leave a note saying, okay, I'm going to rob your house. It's midnight now. I'll be back at 3 a.m. to rob you. You don't get a time. So we won't be able to predict when the end will come. And so the way to be ready is to live faithfully, is to just, in a sense, keep on going with the normal Christian life. And just pastorally, I find that so helpful. Often if we sort of think extreme times call for extreme measures, maybe now we need to rethink everything we know because it seems the end is coming. And no, keep going with a life of faith. Keep going with trusting the Lord. Jesus will return one day. We don't know when that is. Matthew 24 and 25 seems to suggest it's going to be a long time. So just keep faithful till then. Lots of encouragement, but also the shock for those of Jesus' day. The temple will no longer be where God meets with his people. The temple will no longer be the center of God's plans. That's why Christians today aren't looking to go and rebuild a temple in the Middle East. Actually, Jesus, we'll see, will replace the temple as where God meets with his people, where God relates to his people, where the sacrifice for sin is made.
Stay tuned for Acts chapter 2. We've teased it in previous episodes.
Yes,
So,
Acts chapter 2. Stay tuned.
Await the Holy Spirit and get excited about that more then than I already am now. We then have more parables, but we will save those, we'll bank those. But we do jump in to a detailed account of Jesus' betrayal, his trial, his death, and his resurrection. Matt, can you give us a little storytell in to this section?
I love how Matthew's sort of put together, encouraged to see Jesus anointed by this woman, this alabaster jar, very expensive ointment, worth a fortune. I think we learn in one of the other Gospels, probably an inheritance piece. Inheritance, you just have this really valuable thing. And she just pours it on Jesus' head as he reclined at table, just utter devotion. And the disciples are grumpy with her and look down on her. And I love how Jesus says, no, none of that. She's done a beautiful thing. And it's just a wonderful window into how Jesus views our acts of devotion. Was this woman sinless? Was this woman perfect? Like, we're not claiming she was sort of some ultimate superhero in the faith. She probably had struggles like all of us do. But she expressed devotion to Jesus, and he just said, shut up, everyone. She's done something beautiful. That's how Jesus views our devotion. I just find that a wonderful thing, that Jesus really delights in the devotion of his people. Jesus says, truly I tell you, whether this gospel is proclaimed through the whole world, what she's done will be told, and we're literally telling it now. So Jesus honors this woman compared to all these different religious groups we've had, and nobody, but honored by Jesus. But then Judas, then one of the 12, someone who's had all these privileges, went to the chief priest and says, what will you give me to hand Jesus over? They paid him 30 pieces of silver. That's a fairly low, a few months' wages compared to sort of probably years worth of wages. And I think there's a contrast. She would give everything for Jesus. Judas, 30 pieces of silver. Just it's not even a huge sum. But that's how he values Jesus. Also, we get in Zechariah, this was sort of this 30 pieces of silver was foretold there. But just those two pictures I find really compelling of the beautiful devotion versus Judas, who spent so long with Jesus, yet actually at the end of the day, what's Jesus worth to him? Well, if I can make 30 pieces of silver, that'll do me. I'm drawn into that particular scene.
We then have the disciples freaking out a bit as to who's going to betray Jesus at the Passover. But you get this last bit in verse 25. Judas, who would betray him, answered, "Is it I, Rabbi?" He said to him, "You have said so." And it's just like, again, it's just like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? I mean, we know the story, but you're just there like, here we are. It's literally about to go down. Jesus telling Peter that he's going to deny him. And I just think, again, it's easy to be like, oh, come on, Peter, like, pull yourself together. But just, to know that feeling of being, having when the cock crows and he looks across and he sees him, that moment for me just is like when you realise your sin, when you realise something you've done, and that sense of horror is real. That's not the end of Peter's story. I just love that we do get more story. The resonance of messing up, but then that's not the end. That doesn't have to be where it finishes. But back to this bit of the story, they all are out in Gethsemane in the garden. We have maybe another Adam figure in another garden, this time maybe doing things a little differently from his perhaps predecessor Adam.
Yeah.
So we get Jesus going off to pray, and unfortunately the disciples fall asleep.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just, I love the emotion of, I say I love, maybe that's the wrong word, but I find it just so compelling. I think probably here, more than anywhere in the New Testament, we get sort of the heart of Jesus on display. And just he's so alone. And I just think, just probably in the dark, and the disciples can't even stay with him, and just, he's been with this group of followers, but he will have to die for sin, and him alone. And just to see just kind of the sorrow. I mean, Jesus says, my heart is overwhelmed with sorrow, and probably alluding to Psalm 13. Psalm 13 speaks of unceasing anguish and sorrow in my heart. It's very similar language. Almost Jesus is drawing on the language of the Psalms to express this deep sorrow. And I think the Garden of Gethsemane is really important, because we mustn't think of the crucifixion purely as a sort of a transactional thing. We're sinful and deserve judgment, but Jesus died on the cross, so our judgment can be laid on him. His righteousness can be given to us. The end. That's very easy to say, and you get to Gethsemane and you realise that is not an easy thing to do. There's an old hymn, I think, that says, "Go to dark Gethsemane, linger there a while." And I just love that. Just go to Gethsemane and just see Jesus on his knees saying, "Father, if there's any other way, Just the anguish. This was not an easy thing for Jesus to go to the cross. And I just think we see his heart, yet for the joy set before him, the joy, the salvation of his people, you and me. Actually, when I think of the cross as just I'm sinful in a very kind of schematic way or something, actually Gethsemane reminds me this was a real human person. Yes, a real human person who was God himself, but someone who really suffered, and that suffering was very, very lonely, very, very real. I just think we sort of just get a window into Jesus' heart before all that happens later. The betrayal, this is one of the most probably the most iconic scenes in literature, probably, betrayed by a kiss. And there's just symbolism sort of pulsing through that of this friend, as Judas should have been. One of the 12. Matthew keeps on saying that. He keeps on calling Judas one of the 12. And we're like, we know he was one of the 12, but he's going, no, one of the 12, as in just highlighting, let's remember who the betrayer is. He's a guy who's lived with Jesus. Jesus even speaks to him, friend. He says, do what you've come to do. And Jesus says all this is so that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Actually, if we've read the Old Testament, if we've read the Psalms, we know that the king suffers a lot before he receives his glory. If we've read Isaiah, we know that the suffering servant who God will bring his purposes about through will be a suffering servant. But they probably hadn't worked all this out then. And so this is a big shock to the disciples. So Peter gets his sword out and starts hacking about with it, thinking, we've got to stop this. You can imagine Jesus saying, no, I'm not that sort of king, Peter. And so he's taken off to be tried, with sort of inverted commas, don't we? Jesus' trial, which was anything but a real trial.
So we have our puppet trial, and Judas, remorseful, perhaps, maybe not repentant, hanging himself. And then we get that reference that we looked at before in the Old Testament about the potter's field and the money and all of that going on. And then the crowd chooses Barabbas. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
This is the great feast. All the politics at this point are important. The Romans being quite nervous at this point because Jerusalem is absolutely packed to the rafters with people from all over the place. They've come up for the feast. And so at the feast, normally they'd customarily release a prisoner, probably a way of appeasing the Jewish people. And really there's two options. There's this notorious prisoner Barabbas, who that's why had taken part in rebellion, and I think probably maybe this kind of revolutionary type figure. And you've got Jesus, and there are similarities between them we could think about. But it's interesting, I think there's something to do with what sort of person do the people want? Who will best carry the hopes of their nation faced with Roman oppression? And in a lovely line from a song by John Guerra, they say trading a king for a hero. Rather than going for Jesus, who will bring God's Old Testament promises to pass actually by dying and all the rest of it. They just want a hero. They want a hero, maybe who will one day rise up against the Romans. I think we see something of what humanity wants, maybe way back to when the people wanted a king in Samuel, and they wanted Saul. They wanted this mighty figure, and God is going to show, my kingship is going to look different from that. And immediately what happens? Jesus is mocked, stripped, put a purple or scarlet robe on him, crown of thorns, kind of royal type connotations. But the point is, they're saying there's nothing less royal than this. There's nothing less kingly than what we see here, this beaten, frail man dying on a cross. And of course, God's verdict would be there's nothing more kingly. That's how power and authority are wielded. Actually, there's nothing more God-like. As Jesus died on the cross, he's not stepping out of character from who he is. Actually, he's most fully revealing the heart of God. We get wonderful things here about the sort of way our God expresses his power and achieves his kingdom. And it's not what we'd expect. It's in blood and nails and a Roman cross.
Let me read us a little bit of that. Chapter 27, starting at verse 45. From noon until 3 p.m, darkness came over all the land. About 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing there heard this, they said, He's calling Elijah. Immediately, one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Ooh, these words don't get old. It's pretty huge. And I've got my Old Testament ears on, but there's things that are ringing bells here from what we have covered through our journey of the Overbrew so far. But what are some things that we can't not stop over in the death of Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, Old Testament fulfillment throughout Matthew, but yeah, here, I mean, probably four things we definitely want to grab onto. Darkness over the land, 6th hour until the 9th hour, basically probably midday till 3 o'clock. One of the plagues on Egypt. Darkness was a sign of God's judgment. What's going on at the cross? God's judgment. And of course, we'll see it's God's judgment actually falling on Jesus, the innocent one, in the place of us, the guilty ones. Actually, some of the prophets would even speak of the sun going black at midday as a sign of God's judgment. So even the time is fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. So darkness, the Lord's judgment. Jesus crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's Psalm 22. This gives us the interpretation. What's happening with the judgment is Jesus is bearing the weight of God's judgment such that Jesus can be forsaken by the Father. We can hardly think of more anguished words for the Son of God to speak than speak of being forsaken by the Father. That separation for us. Interestingly, he faced God's judgment, was separated. The results, the temple curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. The temple curtain we've seen way back from people cast out of Eden and the cherubim guarding the way into the presence of God. Those cherubim get symbolized in the temple curtain, preventing the people come into the presence of God because of their unholiness. There's been this big no entry sign throughout the story. The story has all been about, can humanity get back into the paradise of God? And we've had little hints. We've had the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Jesus dies, the full and final sacrifice for sin, and the temple curtain is torn from top to bottom. This is God's doing. The way is open. He's taken out. He's forsaken, so we can come in.
Wow.
And a detail that is only in Matthew's gospel, the people come back to life. The tombs are opened and people come back to life. And I think portraying what Jesus achieved by his death. He faced judgment and separation so we can have access to God and life. Look in the Old Testament, and this is one of the prophecies when God fully and finally comes to do this great work of salvation they're looking for. This will be one of the signs. Ezekiel chapter 37 verse 12. "Thus says the Lord your God, behold, I will open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people, and I will bring you into the land of Israel, and you shall know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and raise you." This is one of those signs these days are coming to pass. That passage also speaks of God's Spirit being poured out, which is just around the corner. An Acts 2 trailer. So yeah, Jesus goes out, faces judgment, so we can come in and know life. The absolute high point of the story so far. So many threads are coming together in this moment.
We wonderfully get Matthew's account of the resurrection. I'm in. if he can go through death, that's where I want to put my hope and trust.
I heard the story of someone storytelling these events in a school, and one of the kids had no Christian background. When he heard about the resurrection, just stood up at the back of the class and said, "What? What just happened?" Sort of just couldn't believe the shock of it. And I think to have something of that, we know how the story ends, but actually the wonder of it, the joy of it. It's not just a theological thing. There's lots of theology, but also the one they loved is back. I mean, Jesus finished the gospel saying, "And I am with you." He came as Emmanuel at the start of the gospel. I am with you, God with us. He finished it, "And I am with you to the end of the age." The resurrection means many things, but it also means the one we love is alive, and that relationship continues. from all we've seen, is there anything that you can be taking away for your Monday morning, Rachel?
I think you've encouraged me to see some more of the depth to what's going on. It's easy to be familiar with the transactional, as good and true as that is, of, what is happening at the cross. This just gives more texture and depth to our own suffering when we see Jesus in the garden. We do learn that he's sweating drops of blood. That's my physiology degree gets wheeled out to know how much anguish that is, if that's going to be what you're experiencing. The use of things like Psalm 13 and like pulling in Jesus with real emotions, a real experience of being betrayed, being lonely, being wrongly accused. It wasn't just tick box. It was so real and gritty and awful, but also just that giving a dignity that, again, we're not going to understand our suffering until Romans 8 style Jesus returns. But to know that this is the God that we worship, one who has these still holes in his hands and side, and it gives me something to hold on to when things are hard, to just know that I don't have one who's aloof from suffering that I can go to, but one who acutely and intimately knows it. Having a little look into that has been a joy, seems the wrong word to use, but kind of a strengthening.
Precious.
Yeah.
And that, it so leads into what I think for me, it's just that last line, I will be with you always to the end of the age, which only just increases in wonder when we realize it's the Christ who was in Gethsemane for us, who still has the nail wounds, who will be with us to the end of the age. The God in heaven that we worship is not different to the Jesus in Gethsemane. And he's the God who's promised to be with us, just as gracious, just as compassionate, just as for us. We can so often wonder if God is a bit distant, but you look at Gethsemane and you think, okay, that shows his heart for us, and this is the God who says, I'm with you always. That's just wonderful.
We will be back for more gospel reflections, but next episode we're going to be in Romans. This isn't a particularly deep theological point, other than we are breaking up, going through the gospels so we can try and focus in on specifics from each of them and not just have them completely smush into one in our heads. So we'll be looking at Romans with our key chapters being 1 to 5, 8 and 12. TheBibleOverBrew.com will have some notes to help you. We're able to do this because of Good News Broadcasting Association making this recording possible. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Take care. God bless. Bye.
Bye.